Stan. All right.
We are the second high school of Katerini. We are all junior ambassadors of the European Parliament.
Fantastic.
And we are here to visit the Council, the Parliament, what else? Yeah, basically from the European
And the Commission, did you go to the Commission?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, we're very excited to be here, all of us.
Very good. Well, how can I help you? I mean, I'm sure you want to hear.
I think you should ask them their opinions on some significant geopolitical issue.
It's a significant geopolitical issue.
Yes.
What were we talking about? What's happening these days?
In Greece.
In Greece? In general? What have you guys been hearing about in the EU? What do you think are the big issues that
Well,
we should be
recently
doing?
there was this train disaster in
I saw
Greece.
it. Terrible.
It was 1 hour from our hometown.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
And yeah, I think we were all shocked when it happened.
Yeah.
At first I didn't believe it. I looked for other
Sure.
sources to confirm it.
Yeah.
Who do you think is at fault here?
Oh, well, I'm certainly not going to say anything on that particular case. But there's an interesting question whenever something happens in Europe, is that there are always different levels, right? There's the local level, there's the regional level, there's the national level, and there's the European level. And who is responsible for these things? And sometimes things have to happen at the local level, and sometimes things have to happen at the European level, and sometimes it's in the middle. So I'll use an example, which is when we had the COVID pandemic. You had COVID in Greece as well, right?
Yes.
You remember this? Yeah, okay.
How many of you have actually had COVID, by the way?
Pretty much all of us. Right. And those who didn't put up their hands, either they don't speak English or they got it, but they don't realize it. Twice I got it. Okay, so who's responsible? Who's responsible for running the local hospital? Who's responsible for determining how much money should be spent on healthcare? And who's responsible for things like making sure there's vaccines for everybody? And part of the really interesting thing about Europe is that we have all these different levels. We have the local level, national level, European level. And sometimes the hardest thing, the most important decision that's made is a decision on what level is this going to happen on. So vaccines, I think, is a really interesting example, where they decided at the beginning, right, we have vaccines, we know they're there, but we don't know how to buy them. So who's going to buy them? Is it going to be, every city for itself, every region for itself? So in Germany, for example, all the healthcare is done by the 16 different regions. Or is it going to be done at national level? Or is it going to be done at European level? And in the case of vaccines, they decided we need to do it at European level. And why is that? Because you cannot have a situation where you have one part of the continent which is fully vaccinated and one part of the continent which isn't vaccinated at all. It doesn't work, right? There's certain ideas in Europe that we should be able to cross borders, to everybody to travel when there are not pandemics. And so they decided that everything should be done at European level. And in a sense, to come back to this unfortunate tragedy, where do we regulate these things? Who gets to make these decisions? Would it make sense for somebody in the European Commission in Brussels to be in charge of the train system in Greece or in Spain? Probably not. It's something that needs to happen at local level or at national level. So it's another one of those examples where the decisions are made at the right point, and then what often happens is that there is a framework where people agree, okay, so I'll give you another example. Driving licenses, okay? Driving licenses. It would make no sense for somebody at the European Commission or the European Parliament to say, when you take your driving license, your driving test in Greece. Have you taken your driving test? No. You're getting there? Okay. Took me a few tries. I'm an expert in this. It makes no sense for them to say, when you take your driving test in Greece, we want to make sure that you know how to park a car in a certain way, and that you've been on the highway, and that you've done 30 hours of classes, right? That makes no sense. But what they also don't want is that somebody, I'm going to use Bulgaria just as a really random example. I know nothing about Bulgarian driving licenses, but Bulgaria might decide, we're not going to have driving tests, or we're just going to give them out, you'll do a test on paper and then we'll give them out for everyone. But then that means that somebody who has a Bulgarian driving license can drive anywhere in Europe, right, without having done a driving test. So all of a sudden, people like me, who had to take my driving test 4 times, right, 5, would just say, actually, it's just much easier to move to Bulgaria and do the driving test in Bulgaria, and then that because there's a rule that everybody in Europe accepts everybody else's driving licenses, then I'd be able to drive everywhere. So this is, again, the kind of very principle, the very basis of how the European Union is built. Local people, local countries can do their own thing, but we have these big meetings with lots of people like this, very important diplomats, who kind of say, can we make sure that at least on the whole, we are all doing the same thing? So that at least if a Bulgarian is driving in France, we can be sure that they at least know roughly how the steering wheel works on a car. So this is the constant thing in Brussels. You don't want to have bureaucrats telling you exactly what a driving test should look like, but on the other hand, you need to have some kind of coordination. And people disagree. Some people think the European Union should do a lot more, and some people think, I work for a newspaper that's in the United Kingdom. Some people think there that the United Kingdom should do a lot less, and they left the EU, of course. So. What else? We're talking about cars, actually.
Yeah, how do you see the tragedy of that? How do you see it?
Well, it would be difficult to define who's really at fault because, I mean, anyone who's at fault could be everyone who could stop the accident. And that could be diplomats at the European Union, the inspector at the tracks, or even the driver of the train. I think the matter is the fact that we have to really take into consideration that Greece is #1 in train accidents in all of Europe and find the issue with our train system.
Okay, that's a fair point.
How about the environment? This is something that young people are meant to care a lot about. Do you think the EU, do you think Greece is doing enough on meeting the environmental challenge? Who here thinks that Europe is doing enough on things like carbon emissions and fighting climate change? Put your hand up if you think Europe is doing enough. Okay, and put your 1.5, 2.5, 3.5. Okay.
I'm not sure.
Well, there'll be an option for not sure at the end. Who here thinks that Europe isn't doing enough and should do more on climate change? A few more hands. And who isn't sure? No. Okay, so now we have people putting up their hands. Okay. What are some of the other big issues? War. Okay, so there's a lot of money that's being spent now on supporting Ukraine, a country at war. We're obviously not fighting in the war, none of us in Europe, but we're supporting Ukraine in many different ways. Who here thinks that we should continue supporting Ukraine in the current fighting by keep on sending them money while the war continues? So who thinks we should keep on supporting Ukraine? And who thinks that maybe we're maybe sending too much money to Ukraine and we should tell them now is maybe time to think about negotiating a peace, even if it means that you lose a bit of land? A few more? A few more? And who's not sure? It's actually fairly evenly divided, actually. Okay. Another big issue. I'm very interested in your thoughts on this stuff.
Okay, how about the energy crisis? How did you go through the energy crisis with the prices of energy?
How many of you are paying gas bills? Probably not that many, right? Have you noticed that the price of energy is much more expensive?
Yes.
You have? How do you notice it?
By your parents.
Okay.
We can hear them all the time. They tell about the president's going up and up and up. And the bills are right now not the money that we can spend in Greece because we don't have that much money there.
Yeah.
But the bills are very, very high.
You're part of a generation of Greeks. How old are you?
I'm 18.
You're 18. So you're part of a generation of Greeks that you were very young when there was the Eurozone crisis, in which Greece was a very, very key player. But a lot of these questions about how generous we should be, how much we should ask from some countries and not others, were really central. And Greece was very, very central in those discussions. And now, in a way, we're having a similar conversation with Ukraine, although it's not a member of the European Union. Who here thinks that the European Union should have a single team at the Olympics? Right? The United States has one team at the Olympics. China has one team at the Olympics. We have 27 teams, right? Wouldn't it be better if we had one football team? Who thinks we should have one European football team as opposed to 27 football teams? Who here is for one football team? Who here is for 27 football teams? The European Commission is going to be very disappointed.
That's not fair. Even in the UK, you have football teams for Scotland. Everybody wants his own football.
That's for sure. Who here would like one day to work in another European country? Okay. And do you think anybody from any European country in the EU should be allowed to move to Greece and live in Greece? Yes? If you want. Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting. With no limits. You're happy that if somebody's in the EU, they should be able to move to Greece and come to Greece. Okay. Who here thinks that the euro is a good idea? Or that whether you should go back to a national currency? Who here thinks the euro is a good idea? Okay. And who here doesn't think it's a good idea? But you don't remember that it was the drachma, right? You're too young for that. Who here thinks that there should be a single language in Europe that would be not for schools and not for homes, but for official business? That, for example, if you go to Sweden or if you go to the Netherlands, you go to university, everything is done in English, and the idea is that more people. You think it's a good idea? Yeah. How about people who don't speak English?
Well, I think if we had English as an official business language everywhere, it would be much easier to learn it and get a certificate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we would already be sure that we're going to need English.
But there's no question of sacrificing the 27 languages.
No. There's no question of sacrificing. But I think there is in smaller countries, there's an understanding. For example, my wife is from Denmark. Denmark is 5 million people. There's an understanding that you're not going to be able to do university research, which is in Danish, because nobody reads Danish outside of Denmark. And so they have accepted that a lot of things are going to happen in English. And I think that's something that's going to happen. You see it more and more, and I wonder if it's going to happen more and more. But it's an open question. What did you hear about in Brussels that you didn't understand? Is there something which made no sense to you, where you think, these people are crazy, why are they doing it the way that they're doing it?
I think the number of relations of the European Union is a little excessive.
Well, what do you mean?
There's buildings of the European Union everywhere here.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what is the point of all this and what are they really achieving?
Well, for some of those buildings, it's an excellent question. If you find out what the European Committee of the Regions does, you can tell me. I'd be very interested.
They're all doing very important.
They're all doing, and the diplomat here will tell you.
They're all doing very important.
A lot of this stuff seems irrelevant, and then one day, it's the most important thing in the world. I think that's the answer, right? There's some energy guys here. Guys who've been working on the transmission of electricity between different European countries. One of the most boring things in the known universe, until you run out of energy. And then it's the most important thing in the world.
And
you
they have a
discover-
whole building.
And they have a whole building. And these guys, year after year, have been spending $100 million to improve the energy connection in between Hungary and Austria. And you think, my God, that's a lot of money. And it's really boring. Why are we doing this? And then you discover you run out of Russian gas because of war, and all of a sudden, the only way you can get electricity to people is through that one interconnector that somebody working in that building over there has been working on. So stuff is really, really boring until it becomes really, really important. Now, does the European Parliament need 700 people when the United States Congress has 435? Probably we could trim some of the institutions a little bit.
Yes, but then the smaller member states would have less representatives.
The smaller member states would have less representatives. But when you're in a union, if you're in a union, at some point you need to accept that you're part of you're part of a whole. I think right now, we were talking about the football teams thing. Right now, Europe is very much a union of countries. Who here thinks that in another 50 years or 100 years, it will be more like an actual country? You think it'll be more like a country?
Yes.
I'm convinced it will be more of a country. It's going to be a slow process, but we will. It is just the march of history that we will get there if we manage to keep at peace. And there'll be questions as to who's in, right? I remind you that an official candidate of joining the European Union still to this day is Turkey, a country which I'm sure you all know well. Whether that remains the case. A lot of questions whether Ukraine is going to be a member of the EU one day. I think Canada should join the EU. I think it'd be a really good candidate to join the European Union.
Are you from Canada?
My mother is. They have lots of space.
It's a bit far away.
They have lots of space. We have lots of people. They have natural resources.
Well, they're free to apply.
Well, I think there is a rule somewhere that says you kind of have to be from Europe. But if Australia gets to join the Eurovision Song Contest, right? This is the next logical step, right? So, what else? Anything else that you saw in Brussels that kind of made you think, this is not what I was expecting?
There were a lot of homeless people, which I didn't expect, and beggars also in the metro station.
Yeah, that's quite a recent thing. And it's in part, Greece has had enormous migration pressures, as you know. And then, if I'm understanding this correctly, but you might know better than me, when a migration route closes, typically another migration route opens. And the migration route that we've seen open recently has been what's known as the Balkan route, which is a lot of people flying straight to Serbia and then coming in. And for some reason, that tends to arrive more in places like Austria, which has seen enormous pressure, and Brussels. I don't know why exactly, but that I think is the reason why you're seeing it. But we have seen a very big resurgence in migration, not quite as big as 2015, 2016, when it was, for a time it became the most important crisis in the EU, but, it's definitely there.
But
So-
migrants are homeless. These homeless are migrants. I don't think so.
Often when you arrive at a place there's definitely some of that downtown. There's definitely some of that. Here's an interesting question, again, that I want to ask you. So, some migrants arrive and they're refugees, and they've just arrived from a war zone. One example being Ukraine, right? Europe took in, I think, 8 million people Really no questions asked. I know people who took Ukrainians into their homes, and it was, I think, a very impressive moment for Europe, where Europe showed its real humanity. Some migrants are more economic migrants, right? They come to Europe because they want a better life, which is fair, but actually not everybody gets to move to Europe, and therefore some of them are not. Some of them are going to should be sent back. They're not legal migrants. They should be sent back. But some countries refuse to take back those migrants, and it's very, very difficult to send back somebody, for example, to Senegal, unless Senegal accepts that they're going to take them back. Now, one of the thorny discussions that the EU is starting to have, which I think is a really interesting discussion, is Senegal, we want you to take these people back. And by the way, we have big trade relations with you, including we allow you to have some imports coming to the EU with no tariffs, so it's very beneficial for your businesses. And we also give you bilateral aid, so we will give you several billion euros to build schools and so on. But we have this issue with migrants. Is it fair, put your hand up if you think it is fair, that the EU would say, if Senegal, you're not helping us with our migration problems by taking back migrants, we are going to cut off migration. We're going to cut off development aid. And we are going to cut off preferential trade treatment. Who thinks that would be an okay thing to do? Put your hand up. And 50-50? Who thinks that would not be a fair thing to do? Okay, and who doesn't know? Okay, interesting. Again, so I'd say 10 years ago, when the EU had that conversation, the response that came back said was absolutely not. You cannot have a situation in which you start mixing foreign policy and trade and development and migration. And now that conversation is coming back very much along these lines, saying, actually, we need to be slightly more, assertive, and Europe needs to be more defending its interests more closely. So that's a really interesting. I'm very interested in the response I got here.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I feel like I got some really quite good insights. And how long are you in Brussels for?
We're leaving on Saturday and we came here on Tuesday. So
Okay.
5 days.
And what's your favorite institution so far?
I think the Museum of Magritte.
The Museum of
We
Magritte.
just went there.
Okay. That's
We
good.
had to rush it unfortunately because we had to come here. But
Oh.
outside-
Who here? All right. So I'm going to give you 3 choices as to which one is the most important European institution: the Parliament, the Council, or the Commission. And this time there's no I don't know at the end. Okay?
Okay.
Parliament, Council, Commission. Who here thinks of these 3 the most important is the European Parliament?
Wait, explain what
No, you're a member of the Council. Oh, no,
explain what they do.
So the European Parliament is directly elected. Has had some issues with a certain Greek in recent weeks. We won't go into that. Directly elected. The Commission is the sort of government, right? They make a lot of proposals. And the Council is full of extremely serious and important national diplomats, and they represent the national governments. Yeah. So, which is the most important? Is it the Parliament representing the people directly elected? Elections coming up next year. The Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, or the Council here? Who thinks it's the Parliament? Okay, we have 1, maybe 1.5. Who thinks it's the Commission? Okay, 4 or 5. And who thinks it's the Council? Okay, you're a well-informed bunch. No, there's no 4th choice. Parliament, Commission, Council. It's not the Committee of the Regions, I can guarantee you that. So
Okay, there's another choice. Everything is important.
everything. All of the above. It's kind of all of the above, but they all connect. I think they're all important, but I think if we're honest, I'm not just trying to be nice to my friends on the council, but what's often misunderstood is the importance still of the member states and the representatives of the member states in Brussels. And you should ask to be invited to the co-rep meetings. Could they maybe?
We could arrange it with the presidency. We would have to have
The-
one ambassador from every member state.
The co-rep meeting is the most important meeting that nobody knows about outside of Brussels, but it's the meeting of the permanent representatives of the countries behind closed doors, and it's where the decisions are really made. And I think there's one thing that you get from your time in Brussels: never underestimate the importance of national members, of national countries in the EU. So whenever people say the EU did this, the EU did that, Brussels did this, Brussels did that, a lot of the times it's Brussels with Athens, with Paris, with Berlin, with Madrid, and so on. So it's a bit of the Parliament, it's a bit of the Commission, but it's also a lot of the member states.
Yeah, because we are a union of equals and we respect each other.
Correct. Apparently. Fantastic. Enjoy the rest of your trip.
All right.
I'm gonna run off. I don't know if they're staying here,
No, no.
but thank you for inviting me. It's an unexpected surprise.
It was a surprise for us too.